Hey there, welcome to Mr.Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The morning of December 30th, 2025, began like any ordinary Tuesday in Wineland Park, a quiet residential neighborhood tucked into the fabric of Columbus, Ohio. Frost still clung to the windshields of parked cars. Bare trees lined the streets of North 4th Street. Somewhere inside a modest home on that block, 2 young children stirred, waiting for their parents to wake up. They did not know, as the morning light stretched through the windows, that their world had already ended. Monique Sabatursky had spent her entire life building something beautiful. Born on October 14, 1986, in Chicago, Illinois, she had moved to Worthington, Ohio, with her family when she was barely a year old, growing up in the kind of suburban community where everybody knew your name and soccer fields hummed with weekend energy. She was an athlete, a reader, and a lover of horses, a girl whose passion spoke of a deep, feeling heart. She attended Ohio State University, where she pursued a master's degree in early childhood education, drawn to the nurturing of young minds in the way that only someone truly compassionate could be. Those who knew her described her as a joyful mother, an avid baker, and a thoughtful planner, someone whose home was described not just as a house, but as a gathering place, a center of warmth that pulled people together. Spencer Teep was born on December 9, 1988, in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he too had found his calling in giving. A gifted student, he completed both his undergraduate studies and his Doctor of Dental Surgery degree at Ohio State University, eventually establishing a practice in Athens, Ohio, where he performed comprehensive dental care and implant-related procedures. Outside the office, he was competitive on the soccer pitch and on the golf course, fluent in Spanish, and deeply involved in mentoring youth through the Big Brothers Big Sisters organization. Spencer was the kind of man who showed up at the clinic, on the field, in the community, always present, always giving. They had found each other in 2018, the way so many modern love stories begin, online. 2 Ohio State alumni, both rooted in the same city, both drawn toward service, toward family, toward building something lasting together. They married in December 2020, and within 5 years, their household had grown to include a daughter born in 2022 and a son born in 2024. Friends spoke of the Teep home as a magnetic place, somewhere people wanted to be, because Monique and Spencer had a way of making everyone around them feel seen and cherished. Their obituaries, issued jointly by the family, described them as extraordinary people whose lives were filled with love, joy, and deep connection to others. But every life carries shadows, and Monique's shadow had a name. Michael David McKee had grown up in Ohio, attended Ohio State University, and graduated from the Ohio State University College of Medicine in 2014 at the age of 28. By every outward measure, he was a success story, a vascular surgeon, a healer of bodies, a man trained to preserve human life. He had made the honor roll during his medical studies and gone on to earn licenses to practice medicine across multiple states: Virginia, California, Maryland, Nevada, and eventually Illinois, where he worked at OSF St. Anthony Medical Center in Rockford. He had the credentials, the career, the quiet prestige that comes with being a physician. What no credential could reveal, however, was what lay beneath. In August 2015, McKee married Monique Sabatursky. They had known each other from their shared world in Ohio, both products of the same university, the same culture, perhaps the same ambitions. But almost immediately, something began to fracture. Within just 7 months of the wedding, by March 2016, the couple was already living separately. Monique filed for divorce in June 2017, and the marriage was granted its legal ending that same month. They had been together barely 2 years. They shared no children. What Monique carried away from that marriage, however, was something she would not speak of publicly for a long time. According to friends and family who would later speak to investigators, Monique disclosed that McKee had been abusive throughout the marriage, emotionally and in more brutal ways still. Witnesses told detectives that McKee had been physically violent, that he had forced unwanted intimacy, and that he had subjected Monique to strangulation. These were not petty arguments or misunderstandings. These were acts of terror inside a marriage that, from the outside, looked entirely unremarkable. Worse still, the threats did not end when the divorce did. After the marriage dissolved, McKee allegedly told Monique words that would have chilled anyone to the bone. That he could kill her at any time, that he would find her, that he would buy the house right next to hers, and that she would always be his wife. These were not momentary outbursts born of anger. They were declarations of ownership, of an obsession that refused to accept that Monique had chosen to leave, and had then chosen to build a new, better life entirely without him. Monique moved forward anyway. She found Spencer. She found love again. She had children. She had a home on North 4th Street in Wineland Park where laughter happened and people gathered. She had, by every visible measure, won. She had escaped. She had built something beautiful from the ruins of what McKee had left behind. But McKee, it seems, could not tolerate that. In the weeks and months leading up to December 30th, 2025, something was quietly unraveling. Monique and Spencer had traveled to Indianapolis, Indiana, with a group of close friends to attend the Big Ten championship game. It should have been a joyful trip, football, friends, a celebratory autumn weekend. But during the second half of the game, Monique quietly excused herself and returned to the hotel room early. When friends noticed she had gone and asked Spencer about it, he told them she was upset about something involving her ex-husband. It is not possible to know with certainty what was going through Monique's mind that evening at the Big Ten championship game when she left her seat early and sat alone in a hotel room. But she knew something. She had always known something. She had lived with the knowledge of what McKee was capable of, had carried his threats with her for nearly a decade, and perhaps in those quiet moments in that Indianapolis hotel room, she felt the familiar cold prickling of fear that had never truly gone away. Spencer had gone back to check on her. He returned to the hotel room to find his wife distressed. He did not know what his predecessor had been doing back at their house that very night. None of them did, not yet. December 30th, 2025 was a Tuesday. The holiday season was winding down. Columbus was quiet. Inside the Teep home, 2 children, a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son, were alive and present, uncomprehending in the way that only very young children can be. The events of the night before, estimated to have occurred somewhere between 2 and 5 in the morning, had unfolded in silence or near silence. Spencer Teep did not arrive at work that morning. The dental practice noticed. His employer, who was on vacation, received word from staff that Spencer had not shown up and that no one could reach either him or Monique. At 8:58 a.m., the employer contacted Columbus Police and requested a welfare check. An officer was dispatched at 9:10 a.m. and arrived at 9:15 a.m., but went to the wrong address. He knocked. No one answered. He left. The error cost precious minutes and perhaps a measure of hope. At 9:56 a.m., a man arrived at the correct address on North 4th Street. He could hear children inside the home, alive, moving, making the ordinary sounds of toddlerhood, but he could not get in. He called the police. 2 minutes later, a female coworker, driving herself to the residence out of growing alarm, also called authorities. The world was narrowing toward that house, toward what lay inside. At 10:03 a.m., a 911 call reported that someone had entered the home and found Spencer Teep unresponsive on the floor, next to the bed, with blood visible at the scene. Police arrived again, this time to the right address. They found Spencer and Monique inside their bedroom. The Columbus Fire Department formally pronounced both of them dead at 10:11 a.m. No signs of forced entry were found. 3 spent 9mm casings were collected at the scene. No firearm was recovered. The 2 young children were safe, unhurt, sitting inside a home that had become, in the space of a single night, the site of an unspeakable crime. The family dog, too, was alive. The autopsy reports released weeks later by the Franklin County Coroner's Office told a brutal story in clinical language. Monique Teep, 39 years old, had been shot 9 times, including in the face, in the chest multiple times, and in her extremities. 1 shot had been fired at close range. Spencer Teep, 37 years old, had been shot 7 times, including wounds to his head, neck, chest, and extremities. Together, the couple had sustained 16 gunshot wounds. The coroner ruled both deaths homicides. The investigation moved swiftly but carefully. Columbus police established that the killings had likely occurred in the pre-dawn hours, the narrow window between 2 and 5 a.m., and released surveillance footage to the public on January 5, 2026, showing a shadowy figure walking through an alley near the Teep home during that window. The footage was grainy, the figure cloaked in the anonymity of night, but it was something. Detectives studied it against other data. Vehicle tracking information that showed a car associated with McKee arriving in the Wineland Park neighborhood shortly before the homicides and departing shortly afterward. The car was eventually traced to Rockford, Illinois, the city where Michael McKee was employed as a vascular surgeon. Evidence linking McKee to the vehicle was recovered. The case was building, piece by piece, 1 surveillance frame at a time. Meanwhile, friends and family of the Teeps were already telling investigators what they had long known: that Monique had lived in fear of her ex-husband, that he had made repeated threats against her life, and that the shadow of Michael McKee had never truly disappeared from Monique's world despite the divorce, despite the years, despite the new life she had so courageously constructed. On the morning of January 10, 2026, 11 days after the bodies of Monique and Spencer Teep were found, Michael David McKee was arrested in Illinois. The location of his arrest carried an almost jarring quality: a Chick-fil-A restaurant located near his workplace in Rockford, where he was taken into custody without drama in the ordinary light of day. The same hands that had been trained in surgical precision, that had spent years studying how to keep the human body alive, were handcuffed and placed into custody. He was initially charged with 2 counts of murder. Within days, a Franklin County grand jury returned a far more serious indictment, for counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of aggravated burglary, the latter reflecting the allegation that he had broken into the Teep home while armed with a firearm suppressor. He was extradited to Ohio, booked into the James A. Carnes Correctional Center on January 20, 2026, and appeared in Franklin County Municipal Court via remote video on January 23, dressed in prison attire, silent. His defense attorney, Diane Minashi, entered not guilty pleas to all counts on his behalf. At a police briefing on January 14th, Columbus Police Chief characterized the killings plainly and without ambiguity. This was a targeted, domestic violence-related attack. During the search of McKee's property, investigators recovered a firearm they described as consistent with the weapon believed to have been used in the homicides. Ballistics and vehicle evidence, taken together with the surveillance footage and the testimony of those who had known Monique, formed what investigators described as a chain of connection linking McKee directly to the crime. The affidavit filed in Franklin County Municipal Court was a document of horror rendered in precise legal language. It described how multiple friends and family members had come forward to tell detectives about the abuse Monique had suffered, the threats, the violence, the decade-long shadow of a man who had declared that she would always be his wife. It described how one witness had told detectives that McKee had told Monique directly that he could kill her at any time, that he would find her, that he would buy the house right next to hers. And it placed McKee at the back alley of the Teep home on December 6, 2025, 3.5 weeks before the murders, surveilling the place where his ex-wife and her husband slept, where her children played, where her life had blossomed without him. On January 11, 2026, the day before McKee first appeared in an Illinois court. More than 1,000 people gathered to say goodbye to Monique and Spencer Teep. Visitation was held at Scodinger Northwest in Upper Arlington, followed by a short service at the funeral home. Later that same afternoon, friends and colleagues and community members filled a Columbus restaurant called Du Amici for a memorial gathering. The family had estimated they might see a few hundred people. More than 1,000 came. They came because Monique and Spencer had been the kind of people around whom communities formed, the kind of couple whose home was described as the glue that held so many together. The family released a statement following McKee's arrest that was measured in its grief and precise in its hope. Today's arrest represents an important step toward justice for Monique and Spencer. Nothing can undo the devastating loss of 2 lives taken far too soon, but we are grateful to the City of Columbus Police Department, its investigators, and assisting law enforcement community whose tireless efforts helped to capture the person involved. 2 children, a 3-year-old girl and a 1-year-old boy, remained. They were cared for by family. They were too young to understand what had happened, too young to have words for the absence where their parents had been. Their mother had spent her career nurturing the development of young minds, had believed above all else in childhood, in the tender world of children who are held and loved. Now she was gone, and the children she had brought into the world remained in a house that still carried the echo of her presence. The smell of her baking, the sound of her voice, the warmth she had always insisted on filling her home with. Michael McKee, as of early 2026, remained in custody at the Franklin County Jail, awaiting trial. The criminal proceedings were ongoing, the full legal reckoning still to come. He had pleaded not guilty to all charges, and the courts would take their time, as courts do, sifting through evidence, weighing testimony, pursuing the slow and careful work of justice. What the evidence already painted, in surveillance footage, in ballistics, in the testimonies of those who had loved Monique, was the portrait of a man who had refused to accept that a woman could leave him, that she could heal, that she could choose something better. The threats he allegedly made after their divorce were not the words of a broken-hearted man. They were the language of possession, cold, calculated, and patient in the way that the most dangerous kind of obsession tends to be. Monique Teep had done everything a person is told to do. She had left an abusive relationship, she had divorced, she had rebuilt, she had loved again, she had made a life. And yet the shadow that had followed her never fully retreated. It moved through back alleys in the early hours of winter mornings. It returned to the neighborhood where she slept, even when she was away. It eventually found its way through a door that showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting, perhaps, that it had found another way in entirely. She had been afraid. Her friends knew it. Her husband had glimpsed it in an Indianapolis hotel room on a December night, when she slipped away from a football game and sat alone, troubled by something she could not quite name aloud. She had lived with that fear for nearly a decade, and she had refused to let it stop her. She had kept going, kept building, kept loving. That courage was not a small thing. The case of Monique Teep is not simply a murder case. It is a story about what domestic violence looks like when it does not end with the relationship, when it follows a woman across years, across states, across the new life she has built with someone else. It is a story about a woman who survived long enough to love and be loved extraordinarily well. And it is a story about 2 children who will grow up knowing, as they grow old enough to understand, that their mother was joyful and brave, and that the world gathered by the thousands to honor who she was. Story 2. The pine forests of Hinckley, Minnesota, have long been a place of quiet refuge, a landscape where families retreat from the noise of the world to sit together around wooden tables, eat hot meals, and breathe in air that smells of sap and cold earth. For the Hazlitt family, a modest hunting cabin nestled deep in Pine County, roughly 80 miles north of Minneapolis, was precisely that kind of place. It was a family inheritance in the truest sense, not just a building, but a gathering point, a living connection to their roots. The cabin sat at the end of a winding, 1.5-mile dirt road off Barnes Spring Road, surrounded by trees that stood like sentinels, and for decades it had hosted generations of hunters during the November deer season. It should have been just another quiet November evening. It was not. Kirk Edward Hazlitt II was 62 years old, a man described by those who loved him as a salt-of-the-earth kind of person, the sort of man who would go out of his way to help a neighbor, who never asked for much, and who found real joy in simple things. He was a father and a husband, a man whose sense of identity was deeply tied to his family and to the land around him. The hunting cabin was co-owned by Kirk II and his two brothers, and it stood as a symbol of the kind of bond that brothers forge over decades of shared experience. Hunting seasons, cold mornings, the rituals of men who trusted one another completely. Kirk had a son. He had named him after himself, as fathers sometimes do, with the hope that something of themselves might carry forward. That son was Kirk Edward Hazlitt III, now 31 years old, and he lived in Cambridge, Minnesota, a small city about 8 miles southwest of the cabin. They shared a name, a bloodline, and a history. But somewhere along the way, the bond between father and son had fractured beyond what most people could see from the outside, until it became something cold and irreconcilable. Kirk III and his father weren't getting along and hadn't for a long time. Two simply don't see eye to eye. These are the soft, measured phrases people use when they are trying to describe something ugly without staring at it directly. The reality underneath those words was far darker. The trouble between father and son had not been a silent thing. It had made noise, and that noise had been loud enough to summon law enforcement once before. On October 17, 2024, almost exactly 1 month before the shooting, Pine County deputies were called to the same hunting cabin because of a disturbance. Kirk too had contacted law enforcement himself, reporting that his son had come to the property and that things had turned threatening. According to what Kirk too told police that night, his son had been drinking, and he had made threats against his father. The father made his position plain. He wanted his son to leave. Deputies responded, and Kirk III was officially trespassed from the property. In legal terms, he was no longer welcome there. The cabin, that beloved family ground, was closed to him. The trespassing notice was a line drawn in the dirt. It was meant to be a boundary that would hold, a legal enforcement of the distance the father was trying to create between himself and a son who had become something he could no longer manage. But a trespassing order is only a piece of paper. It cannot stop a man who has already decided that something else must happen. Kirk III returned home to Cambridge that October night with that humiliation burning inside him. He had been cast out from the place where his family gathered, turned away from the cabin that bore his family's name. Whatever resentment had been building inside him did not cool. It hardened. November 15th, 2024, was a Friday. The deer hunting season was well underway in Minnesota, and the woods around Hinckley were alive with the quiet preparations of hunters. Kirk too had come to the cabin that evening with two companions, his brother, the man who co-owned the property, and another friend. The three of them had spent the day outdoors, and had returned to the cabin for dinner as darkness fell over the pines. The inside of the cabin was warm and ordinary. The men finished their meal and settled in, the older Kirk resting on a couch with a drink in hand. There was the low sound of men relaxing after a day of work, the kind of peace that comes with cold weather and a heated room and the company of people you trust. No one was thinking about what was coming down the dirt road toward them. At some point during that quiet evening, Kirk's uncle, his father's brother, received a notification on his phone. It was from the trail camera that had been recently installed at the entrance of the property, overlooking the driveway. The camera had been set up as a security measure, a modern addition to a rustic place. It was, as it turned out, the one thing that gave the men inside any warning at all. The uncle looked at the live feed on his phone, and what he saw stopped his breath. A figure was walking up the driveway in the dark, moving with purpose. In the person's hand was a pistol. The uncle reportedly said to the others, his voice dropping, "Someone just walked through our gate with a pistol in their hand." He moved quickly. He told the others what was happening and went to a back bedroom to retrieve his own handgun. Kirk too was still on the couch. The other man in the room was absorbing what was unfolding, the calm of the evening shattered in an instant. Seconds felt like minutes. The uncle reached the bedroom, but he never got to his gun. Before he could return, the side door of the cabin burst open. The crash of the door was followed immediately by gunfire. 3 shots rang out, sharp and close and absolutely real, shattering the silence of the Pine County night. When the uncle emerged from the bedroom, firearms still uncollected, he stepped into a scene that would live with him for the rest of his life. Kirk Edward Hazlitt III was standing in the middle of the cabin. He was holding a handgun. His father, Kirk II, was lying on the floor near the couch, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds to the torso. And yet, impossibly unbearably, he was still alive. The uncle could see his brother's chest rising and falling in shallow, labored movements. He was breathing a little bit. Kirk III turned to the 2 men who were now standing in the room with him. He looked at his uncle and the other witness, and he told them to sit on the couch. Not quietly, not gently. A command, the kind issued by a man who has taken control of a space through the threat of violence. The 2 men sat. They were terrified, certain that they were going to die in that cabin alongside the man on the floor. They began to plead. They begged the younger Hazlitt not to hurt them, speaking to him with whatever words they could find, trying to reach something human in the man before them. Kirk III did not respond to their pleas with mercy, not immediately. Instead, he walked across the room toward his father, who was still lying on the floor, still breathing. He stood over the older man, and then he pointed the gun at the back of his father's head and fired once more, delivering a final, deliberate shot. The breathing stopped. One of the witnesses, in the statement he later gave to investigators, described what he had watched with a clarity that cut through every other description of that night. He entered with a mission, the man said quietly, searching for words that could hold the magnitude of what he had seen. He entered to kill him. What struck the 2 surviving witnesses, and would later strike the investigators who reviewed their accounts, was not the chaos of the moment, but the eerie calm of the man at the center of it. Kirk III did not appear enraged or unhinged. He was not raving or incoherent. He appeared, to everyone in that room, to be completely composed. Witnesses specifically described him as very coherent during the attack. This was a man who had arrived with a plan. He had walked 1.5 miles up a dark dirt road with a gun in his hand, knowing there was a security camera watching him arrive. He had entered through a side door. He had shot his father. He had subdued 2 witnesses. He had administered a final shot to ensure death. He had taken their phones, so they could not immediately call for help. And then, without shouting, without breaking down, without any visible sign of the emotional upheaval that one might expect from a man who had just killed his own father, he allowed the 2 men to leave. "Leave," he told them, "but give me your phones first." They handed over their cell phones. They walked out of the cabin on legs that barely carried them, out into the cold Minnesota night, and they ran. They ran through the darkness to the nearest neighboring property, where they burst through a stranger's door and gasped out what had happened, begging the homeowner to call 911. The Pine County Sheriff's Office received the call at approximately 8:45 p.m. Deputies were given directions to the remote cabin and drove out along the 1.5-mile dirt road, their headlights cutting through the trees. When they arrived, they found what the witnesses had described. Kirk Edward Hazlitt II was lying face down on the floor near the couch. He was deceased. Around him on the cabin floor lay spent shell casings, the physical evidence of what had unfolded there. The autopsy would later confirm the devastating detail of what his body had endured. 9 gunshot wounds in total, to both the torso and the head. A single bullet had entered through the left ear and exited at the right forehead. The final shot, the deliberate one. The cabin that had once been a gathering place for family now held only silence, blood, and the evidence of a rage that had been building for years until it found its expression in 9 pull of a trigger. Kirk III was gone. Even as deputies stood in the cabin processing the scene, the investigation was already pointing in a clear direction. The surviving witnesses had identified the shooter without any ambiguity. There was no mystery about who had walked up that driveway with a gun. The trail camera had captured it, and the uncle had seen his nephew's face clearly in the cabin. But there was something else that made Kirk III's behavior afterward all the more difficult to process. Within roughly 30 minutes of murdering his father, Kirk III drove back to his home in Cambridge, about 8 miles away. And there, he did something strange. He contacted the Isani County Sheriff's Office, not Pine County, where the murder had just occurred, but a different county's jurisdiction, to report that his girlfriend was making comments about harming herself. It was a call that would later help investigators pinpoint his location and confirm his timeline. By 9:18 p.m., deputies from the Pine County Sheriff's Office had located Kirk III at his residence in Cambridge. In his driveway sat a black Ford Fusion, the vehicle his girlfriend confirmed he had borrowed to drive to the cabin that night. His girlfriend spoke to investigators and filled in several pieces of the puzzle. She confirmed that Kirk III had borrowed her car. She told them that in the days and weeks before the shooting, he had expressed irritation about something specific, a new security camera system that had been recently installed at the cabin. He didn't like it. The camera felt, perhaps, like an intrusion, a watchful eye on a place he had once had free access to, installed perhaps in response to the October disturbance. The girlfriend also noted that Kirk III had hunted at the cabin in previous years, but this season, he had not obtained a deer tag. He had no legitimate reason to be at that cabin. He had been legally trespassed from it, and yet he came anyway in the dark, armed. Kirk Edward Hazlitt III was taken into custody without incident at his Cambridge home and transported to the Pine County Jail. The charges that followed were severe, as they had to be. Prosecutors initially charged Kirk III with 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 1 for each of the 2 men he had held at gunpoint in the cabin, and 1 count of first-degree burglary, since he had forcibly entered a property from which he had been legally excluded. He was held on bail of $3 million, a figure that reflected the gravity of what he was accused of doing. Then, on February 19, 2025, a grand jury convened in Pine County and returned an indictment that elevated the stakes even further. Kirk III was now charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, the most serious charge in the Minnesota Criminal Code. In addition to the second-degree murder charge, the 2 kidnapping counts, and the first-degree burglary charge. The distinction between first-degree and second-degree murder in Minnesota is significant. First-degree murder requires proof of premeditation, of deliberate planning. And the facts of this case, the drive to the cabin in the dark, the gun carried openly up the driveway, the methodical execution, the cold coherence throughout, spoke loudly to a jury that this was not an act of sudden passion. It was something that had been planned. Kirk III's next scheduled court appearance was set for April 7, 2025, with the full weight of the legal process now bearing down on him. The Hazlitt family cabin still stands somewhere on Barnes Spring Road in Hinckley, Minnesota, a structure of wood and memory that has now become a crime scene, a landmark of grief. The uncle who survived that night, who looked at a trail camera and saw his nephew walking toward him with a gun, who emerged from a bedroom to find his brother dying on the floor. That man must carry the images of November 15th for the rest of his life. Kirk II's wife lost her husband. She lost him not to illness, not to accident, not to the unpredictable cruelties of fate, but to a deliberate act carried out by their son, the child who once shared her home, who once bore his father's name as a badge of connection, and who on a cold November night reduced that name to something unspeakable. What drives a child to such an end? What is the shape of a resentment that grows until it becomes lethal? The criminal complaint does not detail the specific source of the conflict between Kirk II and Kirk III. Family members say only that the relationship had been broken for a long time, that there had been a history of tension, that there was drinking involved in at least one prior incident, and that the son had made threats before the killing happened. In the months between the October disturbance and the November murder, something inside Kirk III moved past the point of no return. He drove to the cabin. He walked up the driveway. He knew the camera was watching. He did it anyway. The pine forests of Hinckley are quiet again now, the kind of quiet that follows something terrible and does not fully lift. Somewhere in those woods, a family that once gathered around a wooden table and shared meals and hunted together through the November cold has been broken in a way that cannot be undone. A man who was described by all who loved him as good and generous and ordinary in the best possible sense, a salt-of-the-earth man, died on the floor of the cabin he loved, 9 times over, at the hands of his own son. And the son who shares his name now waits in a jail cell for a jury to decide what justice looks like for a crime that no word quite captures. Not just murder, but the severest possible betrayal, the killing of the very person who gave you your name and brought you into the world. Story 3. There is a particular cruelty in not knowing. It is not the sharp, clean pain of a door slamming shut. It is the slow, suffocating weight of a door left ajar, forever open just enough to let in the cold, but never wide enough to see through. For more than 13 years, that was the life Shelley Nagel lived. Every morning she woke up as the sister of a woman who had simply vanished, and every night she went to sleep with the same question sitting unresolved on the edge of her mind. Where is Sherry? The story of Sherry Lynn Lady begins, as so many heartbreaking ones do, in the quiet, unremarkable rhythms of an ordinary life. Sherry was just 22 years old in 1999, a young woman living in Altoona, a mid-sized city tucked into the mountains of central Pennsylvania, surrounded by the kind of working-class neighborhoods where everybody more or less knows everybody else. She loved animals. She loved country music. She had the kind of warmth that made people feel easy around her, the kind that you don't notice until it's gone. And she was a mother, not just a mother in name, but deeply and entirely a mother, to 3 children, a 7-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a baby just 1 year old. Sherry's marriage to Aaron Lady had not survived. Marriages rarely do when the foundation has eroded beneath the surface while everyone is still pretending otherwise, and by the autumn of 1999, Sherry and Aaron's relationship had reached its formal end. The divorce paperwork was in motion. In those transitional weeks, Sherry was living in an unusual arrangement that many young mothers in difficult circumstances find themselves in. She was staying at the home of her in-laws, at a house on 19th Avenue in Altoona. It was a temporary situation, a bridge between one chapter and the next. She was not yet free, but she was almost free. The man who shared that roof with her, her father-in-law, Kenneth Lady, was not someone anyone seemed to view with particular suspicion at the time. He was a working man, employed at the Veederoot Company in the area, a man who had grandchildren and a family hunting property out in Warriors Mark Township, about 25 miles northeast of Altoona and roughly 100 miles east of Pittsburgh. He was, to the outside world, simply a grandfather. He was the older generation of a family in the middle of its own private unraveling. No one could have known that behind that ordinary exterior, something had already gone terribly wrong. On the first day of October 1999, Kenneth Lady told police that he had driven Sherry to work that morning, dropping her off near the labor-ready temporary staffing agency in Duncansville, a small community just outside Altoona. She was last seen going in that direction, he said. After that, he went to his own job at the Veederoot plant, he claimed. It was a clean, simple story, the kind that, in 1999, with no cameras on every corner and no digital trail to follow, was difficult to challenge quickly. When Sherry didn't come home that day, and then didn't come home the next, the first response among those who knew her was not immediate alarm in the way one might hope. Her father told investigators that he had heard rumors, just rumors, that Sherry had run off to Maine with a man she had been seeing. She was an adult. She did not technically fit the formal criteria at the time for an official missing person declaration. So the system that should have begun searching for her instead quietly filed the thought away under adult who chose to leave. It was a failure of intuition masquerading as procedure. Aaron Lady, Sherry's estranged husband, initially shared some version of this belief. He told investigators that he had at first thought perhaps she had left. Perhaps she had run away to start over somewhere new. But as the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, a colder truth began to press itself upon him. Sherry had not contacted their children. Not once. Not a birthday, not a holiday, not a quiet Sunday afternoon. A mother who loved her children the way Sherry did, who had 3 babies under the age of 8, did not simply disappear into a new life and never call. Aaron began to doubt. The doubt grew until it was no longer doubt, but a terrible, unspoken certainty he could not yet name. But certainty without evidence is not justice. It is just grief wearing a different coat. Sherry's sister, Shelley Nagel, was not willing to accept silence. For years, through the early 2000s, through the mid-2000s, through the slow passage of a decade that should have delivered answers, Shelley knocked on doors. She called the Altoona Police Department. She pushed and pleaded and demanded, in the way only someone who loves a missing person can push, that the case be looked at more carefully. The police did not look too closely. For 13 years, the case sat largely dormant, classified in a way that left Sherry neither found nor truly searched for. For Shelley, this was its own kind of wound, not just losing her sister, but watching the world move on as if Sherry had never been there at all. Then in August 2012, something shifted. Altoona Police Detective Sergeant Matthew Starr was assigned to the Sherry Lady cold case. Cold cases are a particular kind of investigation. They demand patience and imagination in equal measure, the ability to read old files with fresh eyes and notice the gap that everyone before you missed. Starr was that kind of investigator. Over the autumn of 2012, working methodically through old records and conducting new interviews, he began to find cracks in the story Kenneth Lady had told back in 1999. The crack that opened the widest was the alibi itself. Kenneth Lady had told investigators in 1999 that after dropping Sherry near the staffing agency, he had gone directly to his job at the Veeder-Root plant. It seemed verifiable, the sort of detail that would either hold or fall apart quickly. But Starr discovered, over a decade after the fact, that Kenneth Lady had not been at work on October 1st, 1999. He had been off work for an entire week. The simplest part of his story, the part that should have been checked first, had never been properly verified. For 13 years, a lie had sat unchallenged. As the investigation deepened and the case moved into Huntingdon County, where Kenneth Lady's family-owned hunting property sat on 155 acres of rural Pennsylvania land, state police were brought in alongside the Altoona detectives. Interviews with family members and others close to the case began pointing quietly toward that property in Warriors Mark Township as a possible burial site. The Lady family grandchildren had been brought there over the years, to the same land where their mother may have been buried. That detail is one of those facts that lands like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples moving outward long after the stone has sunk. On April 19, 2013, investigators made their move. State police went to Kenneth Lady's home in Altoona, intending to bring him in for further questioning. What happened next was not the quiet cooperation of an innocent man. Kenneth Lady, then 65 years old, tried to barrel past the officers at his door. There was a physical confrontation. He fought with the police, and he was arrested for assaulting a trooper. It was not the behavior of a grandfather who had nothing to hide. It was the behavior of a man who understood that the walls were finally closing in. While he sat in jail, unable to post bond, investigators began searching the Warriors' Mark Township property the following day. They knew roughly where to look, but 155 acres of Pennsylvania woodland, with its rock walls and root systems and ground that had been undisturbed for over 13 years, is an enormous expanse of silence. This was when the case called for a different kind of expertise entirely. Dr. Dennis Dirkmaat, a forensic anthropologist and the chairman of the Department of Applied and Forensic Sciences at Massachusetts University, was contacted by the Huntingdon County District Attorney's Office. Forensic anthropology is a discipline that most people only encounter through television dramas, but in real investigations it is a slow, careful science. The reading of bones and soil and burial patterns the way a scholar reads an ancient text. Dr. Dirkmaat brought a cadaver dog handler with him to the property. They walked the land near the family's hunting cabin, where relatives had mentioned smelling something they assumed was a dead animal at some point in the past. They found some trace indicators, some odors, but no body. The earth had not given up its secret yet. Meanwhile, in the jail, something extraordinary was happening in the silence between a father and his son. Investigators working with Aaron Lady arranged for him to have phone conversations with his incarcerated father, conversations that were recorded by law enforcement. There is a particular moral weight to that moment. A son speaking to a father across a phone line, both of them aware on some level that the truth was already leaking out around the edges. In one of those recorded calls, Kenneth Lady said something that he could not unsay. "I did it," he told his son. "It was an accident." He went on to tell Aaron that if a body were to be found, it would likely be somewhere along a fence row on the property in Warriors Mark Township. An accidental confession to murder passed between a father and a son on a recorded phone line. And yet, even those words, was not enough to secure a conviction on its own. Investigators still needed to find Sherry's body. Without physical remains, without evidence of where she was and how she had died, a clever defense attorney could pick apart a phone call. The law demands more than words. What happened next is one of the most remarkable intersections of persistence, science, and human reckoning in the entire case. About 2 weeks after the initial search yielded nothing, Kenneth Lady confessed to police directly and agreed to take them to the burial location. It was a negotiated confession. Prosecutors, faced with a 13-year-old case with no body and a defendant who was proving stubborn, offered a plea arrangement. Lady would lead them to Sherry's body. In return, the charge would be reduced from first-degree murder to third-degree murder, and the sentencing range would be 7 to 14 years. For Sherry's family, this deal was a wound on top of a wound. But the prosecutor, District Attorney George Zanuck, said it plainly. Without the deal, they might not have been able to find her at all. Kenneth Lady was brought back to the Warriors Mark property to show investigators where he had buried Sherry. But when he pointed to an area near a grove of trees, Dr. Dirkmat's team test dug the site and found nothing. The soil was laced with root systems, and no hole large enough for a body had been dug there. Kenneth Lady was not being entirely forthcoming even in his confession. The investigators called him directly to the site. This is where the forensic anthropologist stepped into an unexpected role. With Kenneth Lady standing before him on the property, Dr. Dirkmat began to question him, calmly, methodically, asking where he had pulled the car over from the road, what landmarks he remembered seeing. Lady mentioned rocks. Dirkmat asked if he meant a particular low rock wall nearby, and Lady confirmed, yes, that was the location. He had moved some of the rocks away, dug into the earth right up against the wall, and then replaced the rocks on top. What followed was painstaking work. Dr. Dirkmat's team dug small test holes approximately every 3 feet along 300 to 400 feet of rock wall. They dug 25 to 30 holes. Then, at one particular hole, a trooper felt something beneath his tool and said he thought he had hit a water pipe. There were no houses in that stretch of woodland, no reason for any pipe to be there. Dr. Dirkmat got down on his hands and knees. He peered into the hole. What he saw were not pipes. "Those are not water pipes," he said. "That's a tibia and fibula." Sherry Lady, or rather, what remained of her after more than 13 years in the Pennsylvania soil, had been found. One leg was still partially visible, pressing upward toward the surface, even beneath the rocks Kenneth Lady had piled on top. When the team carefully excavated the site, the full picture of what had been done to her body emerged in the silent language of bones. The skeletal remains were almost complete, though some small bones of the hands and feet were missing. Not unusual for a burial disturbed and moved after decomposition had begun. And there was evidence, recorded in the bone itself, of something else. Damage to the skull, classified by Dr. Dirkmat's analysis as perimortem trauma, meaning it had occurred at or around the time of death. Blunt force trauma to the head. Detective Matthew Starr had already learned from Lady's statements what had happened that October morning in 1999. Sherry Lady had been at the 19th Avenue house, still living under the same roof as her father-in-law while her divorce was being finalized. An argument had broken out between them. The nature of the disagreement was never fully disclosed publicly. The argument turned violent. Kenneth Lady struck Sherry in the head with what he described as a solid object, either a bat or a pole. Sherry Lynn Lady, 22 years old, mother of 3 children, a woman who had been days away from the legal completion of her divorce and a new beginning, died from that blow. He then placed her body in his vehicle. He drove her to the property he knew best, the family hunting land, the acres of trees and rock walls and quiet Pennsylvania countryside where his grandchildren would later run and play, unknowing. And he buried her there in a shallow grave against a stone wall, and covered her with rocks, and went home and told a lie. The divorce between Sherry and Aaron Lady was finalized just days after she was last seen. Her children grew up without her. Her father gained full custody of the 3 little ones, and they grew up without knowing what had truly happened to their mother. Her son, now an adult by the time the case broke open in 2013, told police that he remembered his parents fighting a great deal, and that at some point he had heard the rumor that his mother's remains were buried beneath an unused outhouse on the family property. He had carried that whisper with him, unsure what to do with it, for years. On December 19, 2013, Kenneth Lady appeared before Senior Judge Stuart L. Kurtz in Huntingdon County Court. Dressed in an orange jailhouse jumpsuit and shackled at the wrists and ankles, he entered his guilty plea to third-degree murder. He was 65 years old. He had been free, genuinely, physically free, for every one of the 14 years since Sherry's death. He had celebrated holidays. He had watched football games. He had taken his grandchildren to the very land where their mother lay buried. And now, in a courtroom, with the weight of all those years settling around him, he entered 2 quiet words, guilty. At sentencing on February 27, 2014, it was Shelley Nagel and her brother Richard Dumm who stood before the judge and spoke for their sister, the sister who could no longer speak for herself. Shelley had spent 13 years fighting for this moment, calling police when they didn't want to be called, pushing an investigation that kept stalling, refusing to let the world forget that Sherry had existed and that she had deserved better. She turned to face Kenneth Lady in that courtroom. She looked him in the eye. She told him that he might have gotten away with murder except for the fact that she had refused to stop pressing police to look further. She told him how he had destroyed lives. Not just Sherry's, but the lives of 3 children who were his own grandchildren, lives he had helped shatter from the inside. He brutally bludgeoned Sherry to death and left her naked body to rot in a hole, Shelley told the court. It was not the language of legal documents. It was the language of grief, raw, direct, and true. Kenneth Lady was too overcome with emotion to speak at his own sentencing. His attorney read a brief statement on his behalf, expressing regret that circumstances had spiraled out of control, regret for not coming forward sooner, regret for the pain he had caused. The judge sentenced him 14 years in state prison. Sherry's family understood, intellectually, why the plea deal had been necessary. But understanding something and accepting it are not always the same thing. 7 to 14 years for a life taken and hidden for 14 years. The mathematics of justice rarely feel equal to the mathematics of grief. In the years that followed, Shelley Nagel did not stop fighting. She gathered more than 30,000 signatures on a petition opposing Kenneth Lady's release on parole. She appeared before the parole board, year after year, ensuring that her sister's name and her sister's face were never reduced to a closed file in a cabinet somewhere. She fought to keep him behind bars, and 4 times, for separate parole hearings, the board denied his release, citing among their reasons his lack of remorse and refusal to genuinely accept responsibility. For over 13 years she was missing, and all that time he was free, and he knew what he did, Shelley said. It is a sentence that does not need elaboration. The story of Sherry Lynn Lady is also, at its core, a story about what happens when a system fails to ask the right question at the right time. The most basic check, verifying Kenneth Lady's alibi, confirming whether he had actually been at work on October 1st, 1999, was never done in 1999. Had it been done, a lie would have unraveled almost immediately. The path to truth was not hidden behind complex forensics or elaborate subterfuge. It was waiting in an employment record that nobody pulled until 2012. 13 years, 3 children without a mother, a sister without her sister, an entire family without answers, all of it resting on a single verification that was never made. It was also a story redeemed, in part, by the people who refused to accept the silence. Detective Matthew Starr, who inherited the cold case in 2012 and methodically dismantled a 13-year-old lie. Dr. Dennis Dirkmatt, who knelt in the Pennsylvania woodland and read the language of bones. Aaron Lady, who spoke on the phone with his father and helped law enforcement capture the words that could no longer be taken back. And above all, Shelley Nagel, who carried her sister's name like a torch through more than a decade of indifference, and who never allowed the world to forget that Sherry Lynn Lady was not a woman who simply vanished. She was a young mother who loved animals and country music, who had 3 babies and a life ahead of her, and who deserved to be found. She was found. It took 13 years, a forensic anthropologist on his knees in the woods, a recorded phone call between a son and his father, and a sister who would not stop knocking on doors. But she was found, and that fact, the stubborn, irreducible fact that Sherry Lynn Lady was not forgotten, is the closest thing to justice a story like this can offer. It is not enough. It never fully is. But it is something, and in the long darkness of cases like these, something matters. Story 4. The morning of November 10th, 2015 began the way most mornings do in the quiet neighborhoods of Indianapolis, Indiana, with the ordinary rhythms of a young family waking up to the possibilities of another day. Somewhere on Sunnyfield Court, on the city's northwest side, a woman named Amanda Grace Blackburn was already moving through her home, tending to her 15-month-old son, Weston. She was 28 years old, 12 weeks pregnant with her second child, and by every account, deeply in love with life itself. She was the kind of woman people remembered, warm, generous, full of a quiet faith that radiated outward. She refinished old furniture as a hobby, believing, as those who knew her would later say, that nothing and nobody was beyond redemption. She had no idea that the hours slipping by that morning were the last she would ever know. Amanda had married a young pastor named Davy Blackburn in 2008, and theirs was the kind of union that seemed written for purpose. Davy had grown up in Alabama, the son of a pastor himself, shaped by faith from his earliest years. He was passionate, driven, and possessed of a restless dream, to plant a church in a city that needed one. In 2012, Davy and Amanda packed up their lives and moved to Indianapolis, leaving behind the comfort of North Carolina to begin something entirely new. They called it Resonate Church. The goal was ambitious and idealistic in equal measure, to create a community that would cause a city to come alive. Amanda embraced it fully, standing beside her husband not as a passive supporter, but as a true partner in every sense. They ran half marathons together through the neighborhoods surrounding their home, praying as they ran over streets and strangers, believing the city they had adopted was worth saving. By the autumn of 2015, their life had taken on the shape of a dream quietly becoming real. Their son Weston, born in July 2014, was an energetic toddler who filled their home on Sunnyfield Court with the particular, irreplaceable chaos of early childhood. Amanda was newly pregnant, just 12 weeks along, and the couple was preparing for the joy and exhaustion that comes with a second child. They documented their lives on social media, posting videos about their church, their marriage, their love for one another, their faith. They appeared, to the thousands who followed along, like a family that had figured something out, a couple who had chosen their path with open eyes and walked it together. What no one could see, what no one could possibly have prepared for, was what was already moving toward them in the darkness of that Tuesday morning. A few miles away, 3 young men had been awake through the night and into the early hours, drifting through Indianapolis's northwest neighborhoods with violence and desperation at their heels. Their names were Larry Joe Taylor Jr., Jalen Watson, and Deano Gordon. They were not strangers to crime. That morning alone, they had already broken into multiple homes in the area, moving systematically, looking for unlocked doors and unguarded moments. They moved in a stolen car, working together, one to watch, one to drive, one to act. They were young men who had made a series of choices that had narrowed their world down to this. Creeping through residential streets before the sun was fully up, looking for what they could take from people who had done nothing to them. The Blackburn home on Sunnyfield Court was not chosen for any particular reason. It was not targeted because of who lived there, because of who Davy Blackburn was, or because anyone knew Amanda was home. It was, in the most brutal and senseless way possible, chosen because of a door left unlocked. Shortly after 6 in the morning, Davy Blackburn rose, as was his custom, and prepared to head to the gym. He kissed his wife goodbye in the early morning quiet of their home, and stepped out into the November air. The door behind him, as he would later confirm to police, he did not lock. It was a small, entirely ordinary oversight, the kind almost everyone has made at some point in their lives. He drove away, leaving Amanda inside with Weston, not yet aware that the world of his family was about to be destroyed. The three men had been watching. From a distance, they saw Davy leave. They waited a moment, assessing, and then they moved. The front door of the Blackburn home opened without resistance. Inside, they found what they were looking for, a home, a family, their lives spread out in the ordinary intimacy of breakfast dishes and baby toys, and a woman who had not yet had any reason to be afraid. They located a billfold. They split the cash. They took Amanda's debit card. Her small son Weston was in another room. By some miracle of terror and oblivion, he would not be harmed. He was too young to understand what was happening around him. Then Jalen Watson and Deano Gordon left. They had the debit card, and they headed to an ATM to try to withdraw money. They left Larry Taylor alone in the house with Amanda and her toddler son. Taylor remained behind with Amanda. Taylor attempted to force himself upon her. She resisted. She fought back with everything she had, in defense of herself and the child growing inside her and the toddler sleeping in the next room. In her resistance, she scratched at him. And Larry Taylor, rather than flee, raised a gun. He shot her once in her left lower arm, then once in her upper back. He leaned over her where she had fallen to the floor, and he shot her in the back of the head. Taylor then stood over Amanda Blackburn as she lay bleeding on the floor of her own home and watched her. When Watson and Gordon returned from the failed ATM run, the pin had not worked. Taylor got into the stolen car and told them, with an appalling casual detachment, that he had killed her, that he had watched her bleed. A neighbor reported hearing the shots approximately 35 minutes after Davy Blackburn had driven away from his home. But no one yet knew what those sounds meant. The neighborhood continued its mourning. Birds moved through the bare November trees. Weston, unharmed and uncomprehending, remained in his room. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, Davy Blackburn returned home from the gym. What he found when he pulled into his driveway would later emerge in court documents with a detail that carries its own kind of quiet devastation. He sat in the driveway, on the phone with a friend, for nearly 50 minutes. He had no reason, in that moment, to suspect anything was wrong. He sat outside his own home, talking, while inside Amanda lay on the living room floor, shot 3 times, still barely alive. At 8:22 in the morning, Davy finally walked through his front door. What he saw stopped the world. Amanda was face down on the floor in blood. She was nude, her shirt pulled up, her clothing disturbed in the way that told investigators immediately that something had been attempted before the shooting. Davy called 911. His voice must have carried everything a human voice can carry when the thing that was supposed to be impossible has happened in the middle of an ordinary morning. Paramedics arrived and rushed Amanda to the hospital. She was alive. Against all medical reason, she was still breathing. But the damage done to her brain by the shot to the back of her head was catastrophic, and the doctors who received her knew almost immediately that she would not survive. Amanda Blackburn was removed from life support at 7:55 in the morning on November 11, 2015. one day after she had been shot. She was 28 years old. She was 12 weeks pregnant. Her son Weston was 15 months old. Her husband was 30 years old and had just lost the person who had been his partner in everything. Her memorial service, held days later, drew more than 2,000 people, a testament to the reach of a life that had not had nearly enough time. Investigators moved quickly. One of the first significant breaks came from an unlikely source. Chase Bank called the Blackburn home at 7:53 in the morning of November 10th, leaving a voicemail about suspicious activity on a debit card. Detectives realized immediately that Amanda could not have been using her own debit card. She was already shot and dying on her floor when those transactions were attempted. The missing card, combined with the pattern of break-ins that had occurred throughout the neighborhood that same morning, told investigators that this was a home invasion. Not an isolated crime, but part of a spree. Forensic evidence began to accumulate. A pink sweater found at the scene yielded something investigators could work with: DNA. On November 17th, just 1 week after the murder, that DNA came back with a hit in the national database, and the circle around the perpetrators began to close with extraordinary speed. Arrests followed rapidly. Jalen Watson was taken into custody on November 23, 2015. Deano Gordon and Larry Taylor were apprehended shortly thereafter. All three men were charged with murder, burglary, robbery, and auto theft. The community's grief and outrage were immediate and enormous. Amanda's case reached national news. She had been a young mother, pregnant, killed in her own home while her baby slept in the next room, in what police described as a robbery gone terribly wrong. People who had never met her felt the weight of the loss. Davy Blackburn, processing his grief in public with the same faith-driven openness that had always characterized him, spoke about Amanda in ways that moved people deeply. He described a woman who believed that no one was beyond grace, who had poured herself into the city that had taken her life. The legal process that followed was long, complicated, and in its own way, a second ordeal for everyone who had loved Amanda. Jalen Watson was the first to break from the group, pleading guilty in October 2017 to robbery, resulting in serious bodily injury, and 2 counts of burglary. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony against the man prosecutors believed had pulled the trigger, Larry Taylor, the murder charges against Watson were dismissed. In March 2021, Watson was sentenced to 29 years in prison, with the possibility of reduction for cooperation and good behavior. Deano Gordon followed a similar path. In May 2018, he agreed to plead guilty to robbery, resulting in serious bodily injury, and 2 counts of burglary. The murder charges against him were also dismissed in exchange for his promise to testify against Taylor. By September 2022, Gordon was formally sentenced to 30 years in prison, 25 to be served, with 5 years suspended. Larry Taylor's case was a different matter entirely. He maintained a posture of legal resistance that would drag the case through the courts for nearly 7 years. His first jury trial ended in a mistrial when jurors informed others of their awareness of the high-profile case. His second jury trial ended in another mistrial for similar reasons. The delays were a source of anguish for Amanda's family, who had already endured so much and now found themselves denied even the finality of a verdict, year after year after year. At one point, Taylor's legal team challenged the admissibility of statements he had made to police before being read his Miranda rights. The case went to the Indiana Attorney General's office, where Todd Rokita's team successfully argued that even if those pre-Miranda statements were excluded, and they ultimately were not admitted into evidence, the remaining evidence against Taylor was so overwhelming that any error would have been harmless. The physical evidence, the forensic DNA, and the direct eyewitness testimony of his own 2 accomplices, who had watched him get out of a car and into a stolen one and heard him describe what he had done to Amanda, was more than sufficient to establish guilt. In September 2022, after a 4-day bench trial before Marion County Judge Grant Hawkins, a bench trial, meaning the judge himself rendered the verdict rather than a jury, A procedural choice made after two mistrials made a fair jury pool nearly impossible to assemble. Larry Joe Taylor Jr. was found guilty of murder. He was also convicted of burglary, theft, criminal confinement, and carrying a handgun without a license across the multiple homes he and his accomplices had invaded that November morning. On October 14, 2022, Taylor was sentenced to 86 years in the Indiana Department of Correction. In the courtroom, Davy Blackburn was present. He had been present for all of it, the arrests, the mistrials, the plea deals, the long silent years in between. He embraced family members after the verdict. Marion County Prosecutor Ryan Mears spoke to the cameras with the gravity the moment demanded. Nearly 7 years after this tragic and senseless murder, justice has been secured for Amanda. In the years since Amanda's death, her family has done what families sometimes do in the wake of the unthinkable. They have tried to build something meaningful from the wreckage. Davy Blackburn raised Weston as a single father while continuing to pastor Resonate Church. In 2017, he met a woman named Christy Monroy, who had come to Resonate Church and had her own unexpected connection to the case. Her stepfather was one of the prison chaplains who regularly visited the 3 men convicted in Amanda's murder. In one of those quietly extraordinary moments that resist rational explanation, the woman Davy would fall in love with again had a family member who had been ministering to the men who had taken his wife. Davy and Christy married in 2018. Together, they founded a non-profit organization called Nothing is Wasted Ministries, built around the belief that even the most devastating losses can, in time, become the ground from which something redemptive grows. Amanda's parents, Phil and Robin, have carried their own grief across all the years since. The particular grief of parents who outlived a child, and who outlived her in the worst possible way. They have spoken publicly about what it means to navigate that loss, about the difficulty and the necessity of finding a way forward, about the way Amanda's presence continues to move through the world and the lives she touched, and the legacy she left. The case of Amanda Blackburn is, at its core, a story about the terrifying randomness of violence. How a door left unlocked on an ordinary morning, in a safe neighborhood, in a life full of love and purpose, can become the pivot point on which everything turns. It is a story about how 3 young men, caught in a spiral of increasingly reckless crime, made decisions that morning that destroyed a family, ended 2 lives, and sentenced themselves to the decades behind bars that followed. But it is also a story about what endures. Amanda Grace Blackburn was shot in her own home at 28 years old, and the world was deprived of whatever she would have become, whatever she would have given, whatever her unborn child might have grown up to be. That absence is real and permanent, and nothing, not the verdicts, not the sentences, not the passage of years, erases it. What her family has chosen to do with that absence is, perhaps, the most human part of the story. They have refused to let it be the final word. The furniture she refinished, the half-marathon she ran through neighborhoods she prayed over, the church she helped her husband build from nothing. These things speak to a woman who believed deeply and with her whole self that nothing is beyond redemption. In the end, the people who loved her have tried to live by that belief too. Not because it erases the grief, but because it is what she would have done. Story 5. The morning light was still soft, the way it is in late March in Durham, North Carolina, pale and cool, with the faint promise of warmth somewhere just beyond the horizon. Tiara was 17 years old, dressed in gray sweatpants and an Elmo t-shirt, the kind of casual outfit you throw on when the school day ahead feels light and easy. Before she walked out the door, she turned to her mother and said the 3 words that families only truly understand the weight of in hindsight. I love you. She was headed to Jordan High School for the last day of classes before spring break. She had plans to spend that break with her best friend Amia, 2 teenagers with all the uncomplicated joy of a long weekend stretching out before them. She was 17. She was goofy and funny, the kind of girl who made faces to crack a smile on the most serious person in the room, the kind of girl who could walk into any group of strangers and leave as someone's friend. She had moved to Durham from Texas about 3 years earlier with her mother Cotia, and though the move had uprooted her from everything familiar, Tiara had done what she always did. She adapted, she connected, she made herself at home. Durham had become her city. Jordan High School had become her place. And the morning of March 27th, 2015, felt like exactly the kind of morning a spring break is supposed to begin. She never came home. What Cotia noticed first was simply the absence, the kind of quiet that settles in when a teenager is out past the hour you expected them, when the phone rings once and goes to voicemail. There is a particular quality to that silence, different from the ordinary quiet of a house at night. Cotia assumed, as mothers do, that Tiara had gone to a friend's house, that the excitement of spring break had carried her somewhere, that the night would resolve itself into a text message and a laughing explanation in the morning. She waited. The house stayed quiet. The explanation never came. On the morning of Saturday, March 28th, 2015, the day spring break was supposed to begin, a man and his girlfriend were walking near an abandoned house on Trotter Ridge Road in Durham. It was a vacant property, the kind of house that sits empty and slightly hollow on a residential street, its windows dark, its yard untended. They saw what they thought, at first, might be someone sleeping on the back porch. The figure was still. Too still. The man called 911. Police arrived, and what they found on the back porch of that empty house on Trotter Ridge Road was not a person sleeping. It was the body of a young woman lying face down, wearing gray sweatpants and an Elmo t-shirt. The officers who arrived at that scene would later describe it as one of the most brutal they had ever witnessed. And these were people whose daily work brought them into contact with violence as a professional reality. What had been done to this young woman spoke of rage, of a fury that had not exhausted itself with the first blow, or the second, or the fifth. She had been stabbed 14 times. The wounds were concentrated on her head, her neck, her face, and her chest. She had been attacked with an overwhelming force that told investigators this was not the detached violence of a robbery or a random assault. This was personal. This was intimate. This was the work of someone who had felt something enormous about this girl and had not known what to do with it. Near her body, investigators found a phone case, separated from a phone that was nowhere to be found. On the door of the abandoned house, scrawled in graffiti, were 4 words, King K the Savage. Nobody knew yet what those words meant. But in the world of criminal investigation, the smallest details have a way of becoming the threads that unravel everything. Tucked inside the girl's pocket was a piece of paper. Investigators unfolded it carefully. It was a hall pass, the kind issued by a school administrator, hand-signed, dated for March 27, 2015, the day before. The day before she was found dead. The day she had left for Jordan High School to begin her spring break. In that small square of paper, already beginning to feel less like administrative paperwork and more like evidence, the investigation found its first real direction. The investigators called Jordan High School's assistant principal, Michael Irving, on a Sunday morning, the kind of call a school administrator never expects. Irving met police at the school without hesitation, because the hall pass in the dead girl's pocket bore a Jordan High School signature, and the school, like most American high schools in the second decade of the 21st century, was covered in surveillance cameras. There were nearly 50 of them, lenses positioned in corridors and stairwells and near exits, recording the ordinary daily movements of hundreds of students. The investigators knew what they were looking for, a girl wearing gray sweatpants and an Elmo shirt, with her hair styled in the specific way visible on the young woman they had found on Trotter Ridge Road. They began moving through the footage frame by frame, corridor by corridor, and there she was. The footage showed Tiara Hall alive, walking through the hallways of Jordan High School on the morning of March 27th, going about her day with the ordinary ease of a teenager who has no reason to be afraid. She walked into a classroom. Investigators went to that classroom and found her backpack still sitting there, unclaimed. The computer at her desk still showed her name in the bottom corner of the screen. A girl had gotten up from this desk and not come back, and then the cameras found something else. Around midday on March 27th, the footage captured Tiara walking through the hallway alongside a male student. From a distance, they looked like two teenagers doing what teenagers do, talking, joking, drifting through the school day in that unhurried way of people who have no particular place to be. Tiara was even smiling. But then, in a moment so quick it could almost be missed, the boy reached over and snatched something from Tiara's hand. Her phone. She looked startled and then moved after him, the way you follow someone who has taken something of yours. Not alarmed, not frightened, just mildly irritated and expecting to get it back. The cameras followed them both out of the school building and into the surrounding neighborhood, in the direction of Trotter Ridge Road and the abandoned house where Tiara's body had been found. The male student appeared in the footage alone after that, walking back toward the school with his long-sleeved shirt pulled down over his hands, the sleeves covering his wrists and palms. He entered the school bathroom. He came out a different person, jacket changed, backpack on his back, and left the school in the company of an older woman. Michael Irving knew who the boy was immediately. He had spoken to him that very day. The boy had told him he was not feeling well, and had been picked up at the school office by his mother, departing with her in what must have appeared, to anyone watching, like the entirely unremarkable exit of a teenager going home sick. His name was Kelton Brescian Fox. He was 17 years old, and he was Tiara Hall's ex-boyfriend. Kelton Fox had dated Tiara Hall, and the relationship had ended, the way many teenage relationships end, with feelings that did not resolve cleanly. But what was inside Kelton Fox was not, it would emerge, the ordinary heartache of a first breakup. It was something darker and more consuming, something that had been building over time in the particular silence of a private mind. Investigators moved quickly. The school bathroom where Kelton had been seen pulling his sleeves over his hands was tested by forensic technicians. Blood was found inside, traces that were not incidental, not the result of a minor scrape or an accidental cut, but the mark of a person who had come in from outside covered in evidence of what they had done and attempted to wash it away. The blood was tested. The results would take time, but the direction of the investigation was already pointed with certainty at a single address: Kelton Fox's home on Cherry Blossom Circle. On Tuesday, March 31st, 3 days after Tiara's body had been found, detectives arrived at the Fox residence with an arrest warrant. Kelton was brought outside, handcuffed. Officers asked him if he understood why. His answer, delivered with a flatness that investigators found striking, was this: "Because one of my friends is gone, and they need to find out who did it." He was not crying. He did not ask what had happened. He did not say Tiara's name. His mother was different. When she understood what was happening, that her son was being arrested not as a witness, not as a person of interest, but as the individual charged with the murder of a 17-year-old girl, she fell apart. The ordinary, reflexive disbelief of a parent confronting the impossible settled over her like a collapse. She was taken to the police station alongside her son, and what happened in the interview room that followed deepened the investigators' certainty, even as Kelton sat calmly and told them nothing they wanted to hear. He denied everything. He told detectives he had never left school property that day. He looked at them with the composed steadiness of someone who has prepared for this moment, who has thought through what they will say and what they will not say. He was 16 years old, the age he had been when all of this happened, and he sat in a police interview room and denied murdering his ex-girlfriend with the deliberate confidence of someone who believed that denial alone could hold the facts at bay. But the facts had a voice of their own. The search warrant executed at his home revealed a bedroom that told its own story. Knives, axes, a collection of bladed objects that went well beyond any innocent explanation. And then in the notebooks, the private handwritten record of a young man's interior world. Investigators found the phrase that had already appeared on the wall of the abandoned house where Tiara had been killed: King K the Savage. It was not coincidence. It was Kelton's self-given identity, the name he had written across his own walls, across his own pages, across a door he had chosen, on the last day of Tiara Hall's life, as the site of her death. The notebooks held more than a nickname. They held the landscape of an obsession. Pages in Kelton's own handwriting described his conviction that Tiara had moved on from him, that she had given her attention and her heart to someone else, and his inability to accept it. He wrote about her with the consuming desperation of someone who had confused possession with love and had reached the point where the two feelings had become indistinguishable. And he wrote something else, something that no teenage boy's journal should ever contain, something that investigators read and understood immediately as the key to what had happened behind that abandoned house. Killing is my hobby. Kelton's own mother, confronted with the knives, confirmed that she had known her son carried a pocket knife. She could not, she told investigators, reconcile the child she had raised with what the evidence was describing. But reconciliation is not the same as refutation. The blood on Kelton's shoes, collected at the police station when his sneakers were taken for testing, came back with a result that closed the last open question. It was Tiara's blood. The investigation had moved with remarkable speed. Within days of a young woman's body being found on the porch of an abandoned house, the surveillance cameras of a high school had rebuilt the final hours of her life in almost cinematic detail. Her morning routine, her classroom, her backpack left behind, the boy who snatched her phone, the moment she followed him out of the building, because teenagers follow ex-boyfriends who take their phones, because that is a reasonable and ordinary thing to do, because nothing about that hallway moment looked like danger. One witness who had been near the Trotter Ridge area that afternoon reported hearing a scream, a single, brief cry from a female voice. That scream, investigators believed, was the only sound Tiara had managed before Kelton overpowered her. He had been physically larger. He had been armed. He had lured her away from the school, using the oldest manipulation available to a person who knows someone well enough to predict their behavior, by taking the thing they would predictably follow. And when he had her in the isolation of the abandoned property, where no one would see, where the graffiti of his alter ego already decorated the wall like a signature left in advance, he killed her. The community of Durham reacted with the weight that only a child's death can produce. That particular, helpless grief of a neighborhood trying to understand how a teenager could go to school on the last day before spring break, in her gray sweatpants and her Elmo shirt, and not come home. Jordan High School, which had known Tiara since she was a freshman, was plunged into the kind of mourning that school communities are not built to contain. Her best friend Amia, who had been waiting for a spring break that would never arrive the way either of them had imagined, carried a loss that no friendship bracelet or shared memory can prepare a 17-year-old to carry. And Kotia, Tiara's mother, who had watched her daughter leave that morning, who had heard, "I love you," as the last words, who had assumed a quiet Friday night was just a teenager being a teenager, had to be told that the daughter she had raised and moved across the country with and built a new life alongside in Durham was gone. The details she was given eventually of what had been done to her daughter at that abandoned house 2 miles from her school, the 14 stab wounds, the injuries to her face and neck and chest, are the kind of details a parent never stops carrying. Kotia told investigators she did not understand why anyone would want to hurt Tiara. She said she still does not understand it, even now, years later, long after every legal proceeding has concluded. That incomprehension is not ignorance. It is the entirely rational response of a loving parent to an act that exceeds the bounds of what love can explain. Kelton Fox was charged with first-degree murder, the most serious charge available, carrying the weight of a life sentence. He was 17 at the time of his arrest, 16 at the time of the murder, and the legal machinery that followed moved through the particular complications that attached to cases involving young defendants. His attorneys pointed to his age, to the still-developing brain of an adolescent, to the presence of what they described as mental illness, as factors the court was obliged to consider. These are not unreasonable arguments in the abstract. There is genuine scientific consensus that adolescent brains are not yet fully formed, that the impulse control and long-range thinking that govern adult decision-making are not reliably present in teenagers. But Tiara Hall was also 16 when she was murdered, and there was no argument available that could give her back the years she never had. The legal process stretched across 3 years. There were hearings, motions, filings, the slow procedural machinery of a justice system trying to do justice to a case that was, in its human reality, simple and devastating, and in its legal reality, complex. The first-degree murder charge required prosecutors to prove premeditation, to establish not merely that Kelton had killed Tiara, but that he had planned to do so in advance. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The narrative reconstructed from surveillance footage was devastating. The blood on his shoes, the notebooks in his bedroom, the graffiti on the wall of the murder scene that matched his own digital identity. These constituted a case that most observers believed was airtight. But proving premeditation, the deliberate, advanced planning of a killing, in a court of law is a different and more exacting standard than the intuitive certainty that the evidence produced. Prosecutors and defense attorneys both knew that a jury trial carried unpredictable risks for both sides. And so, on June 14, 2018, 3 years and 3 months after Tiara Hall's body was found on a porch in Durham, Kelton Brescian Fox entered a guilty plea. Not to first-degree murder, but to second-degree murder. The plea was an Alford plea, a specific legal mechanism that allows a defendant to acknowledge that the evidence against them is sufficient for a conviction without formally admitting that they committed the act. It is a compromise, a legal resolution that sits in the uncomfortable space between confession and denial, and that often leaves families feeling that the full truth was never fully stated in open court. Kelton Fox did not stand in a courtroom and say, "I killed Tiara Hall." He stood in a courtroom and said, in legal effect, "The evidence proves I did, and I accept the consequences." He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. According to calculations made from the date of sentencing, he is due to be released in approximately 2027. For those who love Tiara Hall, the sentence landed with the hollow weight that all sentences carry when the person on the other side of them was someone irreplaceable. 12 to 15 years for the murder of a 17-year-old girl, stabbed 14 times behind an abandoned house 2 miles from her school on the last day before spring break. It is a number that people who knew Tiara struggle to assign meaning to. Numbers, in cases like this, always feel insufficient because the thing that was taken cannot be quantified, and the thing that remains, the grief of a mother, the absence of a friend, the empty space where a life should have continued, does not diminish on a schedule. There is something deeply unsettling in that detail. The cameras had been there to protect students, to monitor for threats, to keep teenagers safe. And they had captured, in their unblinking digital way, the last hour of a teenager's life and the movements of the boy who ended it. They had done what they were meant to do, which was to record the truth, and the truth they had recorded was almost too terrible to watch. What the cameras could not do, what no technology, no investigation, no court proceeding can do, is answer the question that Tiara Hall has been living with since the morning her daughter said goodbye and walked out the door in her gray sweatpants. Why? Not in the legal sense of motive, which prosecutors addressed in their understanding of jealousy and obsession, and a young man's inability to accept that someone he wanted to possess had moved on. But in the deeper, unanswerable sense that grief always arrives at eventually. Why this girl? Why this morning? Why the specific, beautiful, ordinary, irreplaceable life that was Tiara's and no one else's? There is no answer to that question. There never is. What remains, when the cameras are turned off and the courtroom empties and the sentence begins, is the memory of a girl who made faces to make people laugh, who called her mother, "I love you" on her way out the door, who had a best friend and a spring break planned and a whole long life ahead of her. Tiara Hall was 17 years old when she died. She was wearing an Elmo t-shirt. She had her whole life in front of her, and she followed a boy she had trusted down a street because he had taken her phone, because that is the kind of ordinary, reasonable, trusting thing a 17-year-old does when she has not yet learned that some people will use what they know of you against you. The city of Durham was changed, in the quiet way that communities change when they lose one of their young. A little more alert, a little more willing to say the things that need to be said about teenage relationships, and the warning signs that live in obsessive notebooks and violent self-given nicknames, and the possessive rage of a person who has confused love with ownership. Tiara's death became part of a larger conversation about teen dating violence, about the particular vulnerability of young people navigating their first relationships without the experience to recognize when attention has become obsession, and when an ex-partner's intensity has crossed from heartache into something far more dangerous. That conversation is Tiara's legacy, incomplete, insufficient in the face of her loss, but real. Her name is still spoken. Her mother still holds her. Her best friend still remembers what it felt like to be two peas in a pod, planning a spring break that never came. And somewhere in Durham, the abandoned house on Trotter Ridge Road stands as a place where the ordinary and the unthinkable met one March afternoon, where a girl in an Elmo shirt followed someone she had once trusted, and the world failed to protect her in time. Story 6. There are towns in America that hold their grief like a closed fist, quietly, year after year, without releasing it. Oil City, Pennsylvania, is one of those places. Tucked into the rolling hills of Venango County, along the banks of the Allegheny River, it is a small, working-class city of roughly 11,000 souls where, for most of its history, people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. Neighbors knew neighbors. Children walked to school and back without being watched from a window at every step. The community had a particular kind of quiet confidence, the confidence of a place that had not yet been taught to be afraid. All of that changed on the evening of October 27, 1992. And it changed because of what happened to one 11-year-old girl named Shauna Melinda Howe. Shauna was born on July 11, 1981, and she was, by all accounts of those who loved her, a girl with a particular kind of quiet brightness. She was shy in the way that thoughtful children often are, not closed off, but careful, the kind of child who observed the world before choosing to step into it. She had blue eyes and dark hair, and she wore her Girl Scout uniform with the pride of someone who understood it meant something. Her parents had divorced, but both relationships mattered to her, and she moved between their worlds with the natural adaptability that children in such situations often learn. She woke up on the morning of October 27th already thinking about the evening to come. Her Girl Scout troop had plans, and Halloween was close enough that the air itself seemed to hum with it. The day unfolded in the way good days do, full of small, ordinary joys that only become precious in hindsight. That afternoon, Shauna and her troop visited a local nursing home in Oil City, where the girls had adopted elderly residents to spend time with. The kind of community service that quietly teaches children what it means to be needed by another person. Afterward, the troop made their way to a nearby church for a Halloween party. It was a safe and supervised evening, surrounded by friends and familiar faces. When it ended around 8 p.m., Shauna set off on foot toward home. She had walked those streets hundreds of times. She knew every corner. Home was just 2 blocks away. She was wearing her gymnast's Halloween costume, a turquoise and black leotard with tights, and she walked in the company of a friend for most of the way. When they reached the point where their paths diverged, her friend went one direction and Shauna turned a corner, walking alone into the early dark of that October night. It was the last time anyone who loved her would see her alive. At around 10 p.m., Lucy, Shauna's mother, arrived home from work and found that her daughter was not there. She had already received a call earlier in the evening from her boyfriend, John, who had told her Shauna had not yet come home. But the assumption, in those early minutes, was that perhaps the Girl Scout event had run long, or perhaps Shauna had stopped at a friend's house. By the time Lucy walked through her own front door and found it empty, that assumption had expired. She called the police. What police learned that night, and what would prove to be the single most important piece of information in the entire investigation, came from a man named Dan Payton. He had been walking west on West First Street that evening when he noticed a small girl on the opposite sidewalk, dressed in what appeared to be a bodysuit and tights. He had also noticed a tall, thin man wearing a baseball cap walking on the same side of the street as the girl. Peyton had looked away for a moment. Then he heard something, a sound sharp enough to make him spin around. The girl and the man were gone. In their place, a rust-colored car was pulling away from the curb. Dan Peyton did not have a mobile phone. Few people did in 1992, and so he did the only thing he could. He ran to every nearby door he could find and knocked until someone let him use a telephone. Police deployed 30 officers that night, setting up roadblocks, canvassing the area, talking to anyone who was still outside. Lucy and John were told to stay home by the telephone in case a ransom call came, or in case Shauna found a way to reach them. The phone did not ring with good news. By morning, when Shauna still had not been found, word spread across Oil City the way word does in small towns. Quickly, personally, neighbor to neighbor, and hundreds of volunteers joined the search. For 2 days, the city turned itself inside out looking for an 11-year-old girl. On October 29th, 2 days after her disappearance, searchers made their way toward Coulter's Hole, a secluded, wooded area outside of town with a deep stream, popular among locals for camping and leisure. A man driving away from his campsite caught a glimpse of something beneath one of the bridges in the area and contacted police. Officers were sent to investigate, and what they found was not a body, not yet, but something that struck its own kind of fear into the hearts of everyone present. On the ground near the bridge lay Shauna's turquoise and black gymnast's costume. It was damp from having been exposed to the autumn air overnight. And when it was collected and sent for forensic examination, investigators discovered that it bore multiple semen deposits. From one of those deposits, there was enough biological material to extract DNA. In the early 1990s, DNA evidence was still a young science, powerful in its potential, but slow and limited in practice without a known suspect to compare it against. The sample was preserved. It waited. The next morning, October 30th, a man who had gone to a nearby cabin at Coulter's Hole called the police. He had been on the railroad bridge and looked over the side, and what he saw in the dry creek bed below made the world stop. Officers were dispatched immediately, and when they arrived, they found Shauna lying face down at the bottom of a 30-foot railroad trestle, her body wedged between a rock and a log, just 600 feet from where her costume had been recovered the day before. The medical examiner's findings added a cruelty to the cruelty. Shauna had a broken arm and a dislocated shoulder, injuries consistent not with being already unconscious when she fell, but with instinctively trying to break the impact. She had been alive when she went over that bridge. She had tried to save herself. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and chest sustained from the fall, and the coroner determined she may have survived for as long as 30 minutes after hitting the ground below. Lucy and Shauna's uncles were brought to the site to make the formal identification. What followed in the immediate aftermath of the discovery was a community in the grip of something it had never felt before. Not just grief, but fear. The kind of deep, settling fear that rewires a place from the inside. Parents who had never given a second thought to their children playing outside now kept them in after dark. Doors that had never been locked were locked. Martial arts studios in Oil City began offering self-defense classes specifically designed for young children. Posters appeared around town, featuring the beloved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, characters children trusted, urging kids to run, resist, or cry out if a stranger ever approached them. The entire architecture of childhood in Oil City had been quietly shattered, and no one knew yet how to rebuild it. The Oil City Council took a formal measure. Halloween night trick-or-treating was banned. The holiday that Shauna had loved, that she had dressed up for on the last evening of her life, was extinguished. From 1993 onward, what trick-or-treating was permitted happened only in the early afternoon, and even that felt like a pale, diminished version of a thing that used to be joyful. Meanwhile, investigators pursued every lead that could be pursued. They collected over 100 blood samples from individuals in and around Oil City, and compared each one against the DNA profile obtained from Shauna's costume. Every sample came back negative. They expanded the investigation beyond Pennsylvania, following leads as far away as Canada. Thanksgiving came. then Christmas, then the New Year. The case refused to break open. One name hovered at the edges of the investigation from relatively early on. Eldred Ted Walker, a local man who worked at a pizza shop and had a reputation in the community for behaving inappropriately around children. He was tall and thin, matching the description provided by Dan Payton, the witness who had watched Shauna disappear on the street corner. He also drove a red car. Lucy herself had brought Walker's name to police's attention, citing his past behavior around Shauna. But when Walker's DNA was tested, it did not match the sample on the costume. Investigators could find no physical evidence to connect him to the crime, and without that, they could not move forward. The investigation continued, quietly, stubbornly, as cold case investigations do. Oil City held a memorial every year, retracing Shauna's last steps, keeping her memory from dimming entirely into the past. That day finally came in 2002. By then, DNA technology had advanced significantly. Forensic laboratories were capable of running comparisons and extracting matches from databases in ways that had been simply impossible a decade earlier. Investigators took the DNA profile that had been waiting since 1992 and ran it against an updated set of samples. This time it matched. The profile corresponded to a man named James O'Brien, and James O'Brien was already in prison, serving a sentence for attempted kidnapping. The match hit the investigation like a current of electricity. The FBI and Pennsylvania State Police intensified their presence in Oil City immediately. And almost at the same moment, the name that had lingered at the periphery of the case for a decade suddenly moved to the center. Police returned to Ted Walker. This time, they did not go with a simple DNA swab. The investigation around Walker was more comprehensive, and when state police searched his home, they found a man who was under pressure and who knew his story had run out of places to go. The conversations that followed were not clean or quick. Walker changed his account at least 15 times across multiple interviews since 1992 before the full truth finally emerged. What he eventually confessed to was this: the abduction of Shauna had been planned in a twisted way as a kind of prank, an idea that had begun between him and the O'Brien brothers as a plan to grab a young boy they knew, a friend of Walker's 8-year-old son, and hold him for a few hours for reasons that were never clearly explained. At some point before October 27th, the plan shifted, and in the shift, it became something catastrophic. They decided to take a girl instead, believing it would attract more attention. On the evening of October 27th, the three men, Walker and the O'Brien brothers, James and Timothy, were out in a rust-colored car when they spotted Shauna walking home from her Halloween party. Walker was the one who approached her. He asked her something. Some reports indicate he used the pretext of asking about Girl Scout cookies. And then he grabbed her, covered her mouth to stop her from screaming, and forced her into the waiting car. Dan Payton, standing across the street, saw exactly that moment before the car sped away. They drove Shauna to Walker's home. James and Timothy O'Brien took her upstairs to a second-floor room. Walker later claimed he remained downstairs in the kitchen cooking spaghetti until he heard Shauna's voice crying out the words, "Get off me." He said he was outraged and told the O'Brien brothers to leave his house. It was a story designed to position him as peripheral, a reluctant participant, horrified by what was happening. Prosecutors would hold his own words up against that claim in court and let the jury decide what to do with them. From Walker's home, Shauna was taken to Coulter's Hole. What happened on that railroad trestle, whether Shauna was thrown from the top in the same evening she was taken, or in the hours that followed, was not definitively established in the public record. What was established, through the evidence of her broken arm and dislocated shoulder, through the medical examiner's findings, was that she was alive when she went over the railing of that 30-foot bridge. And she did not survive what came after. The investigation that had stalled for a decade now moved with purpose. James O'Brien's DNA match was irrefutable, and Walker, faced with that evidence and with the architecture of his own lies beginning to collapse, entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for his testimony against the O'Brien brothers, He would plead guilty to third-degree murder and kidnapping, accepting a maximum sentence of 40 years. It was not a comfortable deal for anyone, but prosecutors needed Walker's testimony to build the case against James and Timothy O'Brien, and without it, the risk that two men who had participated in the murder of an 11-year-old girl might escape full accountability was too great to ignore. In September 2005, 13 years after Shauna was taken from that street corner, Walker appeared in court, entered his guilty plea, and took the stand to testify against the O'Brien brothers. In that courtroom, he described what had happened on October 27, 1992, in enough detail to make the acts concrete and undeniable. He admitted to being the man who had grabbed Shauna off the street and handed her to the O'Briens. He admitted to knowing they were upstairs in his house with the girl while he remained below and heard her cries. The trial of James and Timothy O'Brien proceeded through the autumn of 2005. The jury listened to Walker's testimony, examined the DNA evidence, and heard from investigators who had spent years piecing together what had happened to a little girl in a turquoise leotard on a night in October. They deliberated for approximately 16 hours over 2 days, careful, thorough, clearly aware of the weight of what they were deciding. On October 26, 2005, one day before the 13th anniversary of Shauna's abduction, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. James and Timothy O'Brien were found guilty of murder and physical assault. The sentence handed down by the court reflected the gravity of what they had done. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Both men, no chance of release. Walker received his sentence separately, 40 years in state prison, consistent with his plea agreement. He died in prison in 2022, before he would have become eligible for parole in 2024. In the courtroom, after the verdict, Shauna's mother Lucy spoke with the exhausted clarity of a woman who had carried something almost unbearable for 13 years. "This is justice," she said. "I still have a hole in my heart, but I needed it to be solved. They took a little girl's life. They spent 12 years living their lives after killing Shauna. My daughter would have been 24, but what does she have? Nothing. Nothing." That single word contained everything. Every birthday that had not been celebrated, every ordinary Tuesday that had not been lived, every future that had been permanently foreclosed on a dry creek bed in Coulter's Hole. In the years that followed, Oil City was left with a different kind of question. How do you restore something that was broken in the heart of an entire community? Halloween, the holiday Shauna had loved, remained banned after dark even after her killers were convicted. The fear had outlasted the danger. Oil City had grown accustomed to its own grief in the way that places sometimes do, carrying it as part of the landscape, inseparable from daily life. The case of Shauna Melinda Howe is, in the end, a story told in layers. At its surface is a crime, brutal, specific, documented with the cold precision of evidence and testimony. Beneath that is an investigation, 13 years long, shaped by the limitations of technology in 1992, by one DNA match that finally broke a decade of silence, by a witness who had been right from the beginning, and a system that needed time to catch up. And beneath that, deeper still, is the human cost, a mother who lived for 13 years without knowing what had happened to her daughter, a community that banned the very holiday its lost child had cherished, and a little girl who tried to break her own fall off a bridge in the dark because children, even when they are terrified, do not stop trying to survive. She had kissed her mother goodbye that morning. She had sung for the elderly and celebrated with her friends. She had walked toward home in a turquoise leotard in the October dark, expecting to be there in 2 blocks' time. She was 11 years old, and she deserved every year she did not get to live. Story 7. The cliffs of Glacier National Park loomed stark and silent against the July sky in 2013, their jagged edges cutting through the Montana wilderness like a warning. The air was crisp, heavy with the scent of pine and the distant murmur of the Going to the Sun Road, where tourists marveled at the park's untamed beauty. On July 7th, just 8 days after his wedding, Cody Lee Johnson stood on one of those cliffs, a 25-year-old with a boyish grin and a heart full of hope, unaware that his life was about to end. Beside him was his bride, Jordan Lynn Graham, a young woman whose quiet demeanor masked a turmoil that would soon erupt into a tragedy that gripped the nation. The story of Cody's murder and the unraveling of Jordan's lies would become a haunting tale of love, betrayal, and a fall that echoed far beyond the rocky ravine where his body was found. Cody Lee Johnson was born in 1988 in Kalispell, Montana, a town nestled in the Flathead Valley, where the mountains were both a backdrop and a way of life. He was the youngest of 3 siblings, raised by his mother, Sherry, in a home filled with warmth and laughter. Cody was a charmer, his friends said, with a quick wit and a kindness that drew people to him. He loved cars, tinkering with engines until his hands were black with grease. And he had a passion for the outdoors, often hiking the trails of Glacier National Park with a spring in his step. His smile was infectious, his hugs legendary, the kind that made you feel seen and valued. By 2013, Cody was working as a car salesman, his charisma making him a natural at the job, and he was dreaming of a future filled with adventure and family. When he met Jordan Graham, a shy 22-year-old with a love for animals and a reserved nature, he saw a partner to share that future with. Jordan was different from Cody, her personality quieter, more introspective. Raised in a religious family, she had grown up with strict Christian values, the kind that emphasized marriage as a sacred bond. She worked as a nanny, her gentle demeanor endearing her to the children she cared for, but friends described her as distant, someone who kept her emotions tightly guarded. To Cody, though, she was a puzzle worth solving. Their relationship moved quickly, fueled by Cody's enthusiasm and Jordan's quiet acquiescence. By June 2013, just a year after they started dating, Cody proposed and Jordan accepted. Their wedding on June 29th was a modest affair at a Kalispell community center, surrounded by family and friends. Cody beamed as he stood at the altar, his groomsman Cameron Fredrickson later recalling how he had tried to warn Cody about Jordan's aloofness. "It didn't feel right," Cameron told investigators, his voice heavy with regret. "She didn't seem happy, not like Cody was." The honeymoon phase was brief, a fleeting moment of joy overshadowed by tension. Jordan later confided to a friend via text that she was having second thoughts, the weight of marriage pressing down on her like the Montana sky before a storm. She felt trapped, she said, unsure if she was ready for the life she had promised Cody. On July 7th, 8 days after their vows, Jordan suggested a hike in Glacier National Park, a place Cody loved. She told a friend it was a surprise for him, a chance to reconnect and talk through their rocky start. Cody, ever eager to please, agreed, and the couple set out for the Loop Trail, a scenic path that wound through the park's rugged terrain. The trail was steep, flanked by cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet to the rocks below, a place where beauty and danger were intertwined. What happened next would become the heart of a mystery that unfolded over months, a story pieced together through Jordan's shifting accounts and the relentless pursuit of truth by those who loved Cody. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cliffs in shadow, an argument erupted between the newlyweds. Jordan later claimed it started as a discussion about their marriage, her doubts spilling out in sharp, heated words. Cody, she said, grew angry, grabbing her arm in a moment of frustration. In her telling, she acted instinctively, pushing him away to free herself. But the push, she admitted, sent Cody over the edge of a 300-foot cliff, his body tumbling through the air to the rocky ravine below. She stood frozen, she said, the reality of what she'd done sinking in like a stone. Instead of calling for help, Jordan fled, driving the hour back to Kalispell in silence, her mind racing. Cody's body lay undiscovered, hidden in the rugged terrain, as the park's wildlife moved through the darkness around him. The next day, July 8th, Cody didn't show up for work at Kalispell's green Nissan dealership, where he was known for his punctuality. His absence raised alarms among his co-workers, particularly Cameron Fredrickson, who had been uneasy about Cody's marriage from the start. Cameron called Sherry Cody's mother, who immediately sensed something was wrong. She contacted Jordan expecting answers, but Jordan's response was vague, almost rehearsed. "Cody went out with friends last night," she told Sherry, her voice flat. "He said he was going to Washington to visit someone. I haven't heard from him since." Sherry's heart sank. Cody wasn't the type to disappear without a word, especially not so soon after his wedding. She pressed Jordan for details, but the answers were evasive, each one deepening her unease. By July 9th, Sherry reported Cody missing to the Flathead County Sheriff's Office, her voice trembling as she recounted his last known movements. The sheriff's office alerted Glacier National Park rangers, who began a search focused on the Loop Trail, based on a tip from Jordan that Cody loved that area. On July 10th, Jordan took a bolder step, fabricating an email from a supposed friend of Cody's named Tony. The email, sent to herself and forwarded to the police, claimed Cody had been found dead and urged authorities to call off the search. The lie was clumsy, its wording stilted, and investigators quickly grew suspicious. When pressed, Jordan doubled down, telling rangers she had found Cody's body near the Loop Trail on July 11th, claiming she had gone looking for him because it was a place he wanted to see before he died. Her story unraveled further when rangers noted the improbability of her stumbling upon the body in such a remote area without assistance. On July 12th, a search team, aided by a helicopter, recovered Cody's body from the base of a cliff below the Loop Trail. The sight was devastating, his body broken, his life extinguished in a place he had loved. The autopsy confirmed death by blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from a great height. The discovery shifted the investigation from a missing person case to a potential homicide, with Jordan as the prime suspect. Investigators confronted her with security camera footage from the park's entrance, showing her and Cody entering together on July 7th, directly contradicting her claim that he had gone off with friends. Faced with the evidence, Jordan's facade began to crack. On July 16th, she was questioned by FBI agents, who had taken over the case due to its occurrence on federal land. Under pressure, Jordan admitted she had been with Cody on the cliff, but insisted his death was an accident, a moment of panic during an argument. "I pushed him," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for him to die." The FBI wasn't convinced. Jordan's lies, the fabricated email, the story about Cody's supposed trip to Washington, her delayed reporting of his body, pointed to a calculated effort to cover her tracks. Prosecutors argued the act was premeditated, citing text messages Jordan sent to a friend days before the hike, expressing her unhappiness in the marriage. "I'm not sure I can do this," she had written, her words laced with dread. A friend of Cody's told investigators that Jordan had planned the hike as a surprise, canceling Cody's golf outing with friends to ensure he went with her. The prosecution painted a picture of a young woman overwhelmed by her decision to marry, unable to face the prospect of divorce due to her religious upbringing, and choosing instead a drastic, irreversible solution. Jordan was arrested on September 9th, 2013, charged with first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and making false statements to authorities. The small community of Kalispell was stunned, the story dominating local news as residents grappled with the image of a young bride turned killer. Sherry Johnson, Cody's mother, was inconsolable, her grief a raw wound as she sat through early court hearings, clutching a photo of her son. "He was my baby," she told reporters outside the federal courthouse in Missoula, her voice breaking. "He deserved so much more than this." The case drew national attention, with outlets detailing the shocking betrayal, the newlywed whose marriage ended in a cliffside tragedy. Online forums buzzed with speculation, some painting Jordan as a cold-blooded killer, others as a young woman overwhelmed by a mistake she couldn't undo. The trial, which began in December 2013, was a battle of narratives. Federal prosecutors, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Chris McLean, argued that Jordan had lured Cody to the cliff with the intent to kill him, her lies a clear sign of premeditation. They pointed to her text messages, her fabricated email, and her failure to seek help as evidence of guilt. "This was not an accident," McLean told the jury, his voice steady. "Jordan Graham planned this, executed it, and tried to cover it up. The defense, led by public defenders Michael Donahoe and Andrew Nelson, countered that Jordan was a frightened young woman who acted impulsively during a heated argument. She didn't want Cody to die, Donahoe argued, his tone earnest. She was scared, overwhelmed, and made a terrible mistake. Jordan took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the argument, insisting Cody had grabbed her first, that her push was a reflex, not a plan. "I loved him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant for this to happen." The courtroom was a study in contrasts. Jordan, small and pale, her eyes downcast, and the memory of Cody, vibrant and full of life, evoked through photos and testimony from his family and friends. Sherry's testimony was particularly wrenching, her words painting a picture of a son who had been her anchor, her joy. "He was so excited to be married," she said, her voice cracking. "He thought Jordan was his forever." The jury, a mix of men and women from Montana's diverse communities, listened intently, their faces unreadable as they weighed the evidence. The prosecution's case was bolstered by physical evidence, the security footage, the text messages, the lack of defensive wounds on Cody's body, suggesting he hadn't expected the push. The defense leaned heavily on Jordan's emotional state, arguing that her lies were the product of panic, not malice. On December 12, 2013, as the trial neared its end, Jordan made a surprising move. She entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder as part of a deal with prosecutors, who agreed to drop the first-degree murder charge and the false statements count. The plea came just before the jury was set to deliberate, a decision that stunned observers and left Sherry reeling. In the courtroom, U.S. District Judge Donald Malloy pressed Jordan to explain what happened. She stood, her voice barely above a whisper, and admitted to pushing Cody with reckless disregard for his life. "We were arguing, and it got out of hand," she said, her hands trembling. "I pushed him, and he fell." Malloy accepted the plea, scheduling sentencing for March 2014, but the admission did little to ease the pain in the courtroom. Sherry broke down, her sobs echoing as she left the courthouse, clutching a friend for support. The sentencing hearing on March 27, 2014, was a moment of reckoning. Jordan, dressed in a simple gray sweater, stood before Judge Malloy, her face pale but composed. Prosecutors argued for a harsh sentence, citing the deliberate nature of her actions and the devastation left in her wake. "Cody Johnson's life was stolen," McLean said, his voice firm. "Jordan Graham not only took his life, but tried to erase his memory with lies." The defense pleaded for leniency, emphasizing Jordan's lack of criminal history and her remorse. "She is not a monster," Donahoe said. "She is a young woman who made a terrible mistake." Malloy, a seasoned judge known for his fairness, listened carefully before delivering his verdict. He sentenced Jordan to 30 years in federal prison without parole, a punishment that reflected the gravity of her crime and the betrayal of a marriage just 8 days old. "You had choices," Malloy told her, his voice stern but measured. "You chose the path that led to this tragedy." Jordan's appeal, filed in October 2014, argued that prosecutors had engaged in misconduct by labeling her a sociopath and distorting facts. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld her conviction in 2015, finding no grounds for reversal. She was sent to a federal prison in California, her life now defined by the concrete walls and the weight of her actions. For Sherry and Cody's family, the sentence offered little solace. They mourned not just Cody's death, but the future he would never have, the children he might have raised, the dreams he might have chased. Friends gathered at memorials, sharing stories of Cody's love for cars, his infectious laugh, his unwavering loyalty. He gave the best hugs, one friend said at a vigil, tears in her eyes. You could feel how much he cared. The case left a lasting mark on Kalispell, a town unaccustomed to such high-profile tragedy. The cliffs of Glacier National Park, once a symbol of natural wonder, became a somber reminder of a life cut short. As the years passed, the case faded from the headlines, but its impact lingered. Sherry Johnson became an advocate for victims' families, channeling her grief into a quiet strength. She spoke at community events, her voice steady as she shared Cody's story, urging others to cherish their loved ones. The Glacier National Park Rangers, who had worked tirelessly to recover Cody's body, added his name to their private memorials, a nod to a case that had tested their resolve. Jordan, now in her 30s, remains incarcerated, her life a stark contrast to the freedom she once knew. The cliffs where Cody died stand unchanged, their silence a testament to a moment that altered countless lives. The murder of Cody Lee Johnson was more than a crime. It was a fracture in the fabric of a family, a community, a marriage. It was a story of love that turned to doubt, of a moment of rage that became a lifetime of regret. For those who knew Cody, he remains a light that burned too briefly, a man whose laughter and kindness echoed long after he was gone. For Jordan, it is a shadow she will carry forever, a choice made in a fleeting second that defined her life. And for the rest of us, it is a reminder of the fragility of love, the weight of decisions, and the cliffs that lie waiting when we stray too close to the edge.